Welcome to Senior Seminar Review. I'm Dr. David Scott. First, let me take a moment to congratulate you on making it this far in your academic career. You're at the finish line. Congratulations. What we're going to do this morning is basically walk through the highlights and just do a brief review of your criminology course that many of you had with me over the last couple years. So let's begin. Loosely, what is criminology? Well, according to Edward Sutherland, it's the body of knowledge regarding crime as a social phenomenon. It includes within its scope the process of making laws, of breaking laws, and of reacting toward the breaking of those laws. So to put it in context, we have laws on the books. We have punishment for those laws. And then we basically review those laws to see if, number one, does the punishment fit the crime, or was there a new method or a new way in which a crime was committed, in which we as a society have to come to some form of consensus to basically decide, is this still a crime anymore, like, say, prohibition in alcohol, for example, back in the 1930s, or something new like white-collar crime that's becoming more and more emergent as the next, last 5 or 6 years, we've seen lots and lots of crimes with white-collar. We've seen forgery, we've seen fraud, we've seen Ponzi schemes, we've seen all kinds of stuff going on in politics right now, and we're tending to shift towards that more and more as a society. So we're going to be talking about some of these trends and changes over the next few moments. Now, some of the key terms that we set off with in the course we talked about, and these are just reviews, the conflict model, our consensus model. We defined basically what crime was. We looked at the criminal justice system as a whole organization, meaning that we have a group of individuals who, at different layers of our criminal justice system, decide, interpret, and then enforce laws so that all of us can live just about as harmonious as possible. We discussed those who study criminology or crime are defined as criminologists. We looked at criminology as a definition again. And then we looked at different types of cultural norms, such as deviance. All right, if you guys remember that term, deviance is going against the expected norms or cultural norms or norms that we've agreed on as a society. For example, speeding. We have posted speed limits, and we all know, and I've been guilty of it too, that occasionally, depending on the circumstances, that we may intentionally or unintentionally go above the speed limit. Now, we all agreed somewhere in the state of Texas, for example, that now it's 75 on most major highways. Some people go 80, some people go 90, or if you're in my neck of the woods where I have a lot of elderly people, they still keep it at 55 or 45. Regardless of that, we do have an expectation of what is acceptable behavior when you're driving. We also look at social norms, and we'll talk about that in just a few more minutes. Now, how do we collect data in criminology? Now, researchers have three main objectives in measuring crime and criminal behavior patterns. Number one is to collect and analyze the data to test theories about why people commit crime. For example, right now, theorists are running all over the United States looking at active school shooters right now. Why are children who've never been on the radar, had any type of background history or background crime, suddenly going into schools and shooting up their classmates, teachers, and civilians? That is basically probably the most, the most important topic right now when we're trying to figure out why some of these things are happening. We're looking at immigration issues. We're looking at drugs now. We're looking at human trafficking, which has been around for the last decade in the media. Then we want to learn the situational characteristics of crimes in order to develop and prevention strategies. Okay, we have this data. We've tested our theory's sound. Now, what are the characteristics or variables that we can pull from this or extrapolate from this data to put us into a working theory on how we're going to stop, prevent, curtail, or maybe even define a new law on how to identify and punish for it? Then we have to determine the needs of the criminal justice system on a daily basis. Just because we have laws on the books and we have different types of classes of punishment and different agencies working different crimes, like I said earlier, sometimes a new crime emerges or a new pattern starts to emerge in criminal justice. And although we're aggressively looking at it, we're aggressively attacking it, we have to make sure that all of our mechanisms are in place, such as law enforcement, investigations, the courts, and as well as corrections, are basically in line and able to deal with this. Now, we're going to go back in time for just a few moments, if you'll indulge me, and we're going to talk about how the evolution of criminology began. We start off in the mid-18th century, what we call the classical school or classical criminology, and there's only two key figures in there that I'm really concerned about and we discussed in class at great length. One was Caesar Beccaria, and then we had Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism. Now, these were based on the assumption that individuals choose to commit crimes after weighing the costs or consequences of their actions, kind of a cost-benefit analysis, if you will. Well, no one's looking. I can put my hand in the cookie jar. No one's going to miss this cookie. eat it real quickly and run away before my mom and dad see me. Well, there's no troopers or police around and I'm running late, so I got to go 5, 10, 15 miles over the speed limit. We weigh it out. If we get stopped, we may get our hands slapped, we may have to go to timeout for the cookie, or we might get a $500 or $1,200 ticket for exceeding the speed limit that's posted. So what it boiled down to is these theorists claim that free will equaled pleasure versus pain. We weigh out how much trouble, if it's going to hit us in our wallet, if it's going to hit our time, us going to court, us getting a speech or some kind of reprimand. We weigh it out, all right? And most civilized individuals do this. Now, we also, like I said, weighing the cost of crime versus the consequences, we all theorize now that many criminals, we do this in law enforcement, we do this in the courts. We look at someone walking by a jewelry store, someone trying to shoplift at a local Walmart, Easy Mart, or 7-Eleven, someone who's about to break into a car. Am I going to get caught? Is it worth it? What's in there? What can I sell or possibly fence? And what's my getaway? Am I a repeat offender? Meaning that if I've been arrested 2 or 3 or 4 times, what's the likelihood I may go away for life for something as simple as stealing some CDs or a pack of gum or something at a Walmart? So they weigh this stuff out. So let's start with Cesar Beccaria. Now, he had several points and theories, and I've just condensed them down for you to review. But basically, he said that laws should be used to maintain the social contract, meaning that we all agree to give up certain things in our lives so we can live harmoniously, all right? So we can get along in a society, in a town, in a city, and hopefully in this world. Only legislators should create laws. We shouldn't have officers, we shouldn't have judges basically making laws on the fly. We should interpret the laws that are handed down to us, have them interpret it, and we enforce those laws. Judges should impose punishment only in accordance with the prescribed law. Judges should not interpret the laws, they should just enforce them. Punishment should be based on the pleasure and pain principle. Punishment should be based on the act, not the actor, meaning that someone's background, ethnicity, social status, how affluent they are should not matter. If one person commits the crime, the next person who commits the same crime should get an expected or the same punishment. The punishment should be determined by the crime. Punishment should be prompt and effective, meaning that it's like dealing with a small child. If you want to change behavior, his theory was you have to see it, stop it immediately, and correct it. It does no good to anybody if you basically wait a day, a week, a month or two to punish someone who's already forgotten what they did. All people should be treated equally, regardless of their background, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their beliefs. Capital punishment should be abolished. This was something he believed in. The use of torture to gain confession should be abolished, and it's better to prevent crimes than to punish them. So he was on the front side saying if we have enough rules and enough in our social contract and we have enough people understanding what the rules are, his theory was that we should be on the front end preventing it instead of on the back end basically punishing every lawbreaker, and hopefully those numbers would be smaller compared to the crimes up front. Now, next we talked about Jeremy Bentham. Now, he was also one of the theorists from the classical criminology, and he believed in a concept called utilitarianism. Now, he assumes, or he postulated, that all human actions are calculated in accordance with their likelihood of bringing happiness, which would be pleasure, or unhappiness, pain. Again, going back to that cost-benefit analysis, if you look at it on a scale, is it going to get me more pleasure, or am I going to be put in prison, have to pay a fine, or be humiliated or shamed if I'm caught? Now, moving forward during the mid-18th century, we took a shift from the classical to a group of individuals called the positives, or positive criminology, and we focused a lot on the biology, all right, or biology determinants. And we had several people. Most notably is Charles Darwin, who wrote The Origin of Species, meaning that you had the survival of the fittest. You had the ones who evolved, we all crawled out of the sea, and we all basically have an origin here on this planet. We have another Caesar, don't confuse him with Cesar Beccaria, but we had a gentleman named Cesar Lombroso who believed in born criminals, and he is also known as the father of modern criminology. I'd remember that if I were you. We had Richard Dugdale, who related criminal behaviors to an inherited traits. If you remember in the class, we talked about groups of families and the belief that there was something encoded in their genetic makeup or DNA that made them all predisposed to criminals. And we had the Jukes family that he studied. Some were prostitutes, some were thieves, some were murderers, but not all of them. Raphael Garofalo traced the roots of criminal behaviors to moral abnormalities. And then we had Enrico Ferri, Ferri, that produced the first penal code that we knew about and introduced social accountability, meaning that we're all accountable for our own actions when we live in a social group. That you can't have any of these outliers committing all these crimes and not hold them accountable by societal standards. We had Ernest Houghton, who related criminality to the hereditary of the inferiority. We had Ernest Kretschmer, who introduced the somatotypes. If y'all remember the somatotypes about how different types of physical looks and physical discrepancies on a particular individual, and he introduced that as a possible explanation as to why people committed crime from a biological perspective. Then we had William Sheldon, and if you remember William Sheldon, he related criminal behavior that could be identified by certain body types, and he had 3 types. He had the endomorph body types, which was the soft, heavy, kind of fluffy roundness people. Mesomorphs that were muscular, very lean, very cut, very ripped individuals, and then the ectomorph, which were basically your thin, almost starving in some cases, and slim-boned individuals. Now, switching from the biological for just a moment, we had the psychological determinism theorists. The first one we recall from our readings was Isaac Ray, and he questioned whether those who were morally insane could be held legally responsible for their actions. Now, with that being said, it could be argued that Isaac Ray was the first one that kind of came up with the insanity plea that we kind of see in our courts and TV shows when we're watching all our CSI stuff. But he said, if someone's truly insane, someone who does not have control of all their mental faculties, and they commit a crime, how could we say that a reasonable person could not only see this coming and choose between right and wrong, but how can you condemn someone who has no control over their moral and intellectual faculties? We had Henry Maudsley, who pioneered the criteria for legal responsibility, and then Henry H. Goddard, who related criminal behavior to intelligence. He went out there and said, well, obviously, in his theory it depends on how smart or what your IQ was. Were you able to process, synthesize information to defer right or wrong? Then we had what we call the sociological determinism theorists. We had several of these. I'm going to go through them real quick. We had Adolphe Quetelet, who's reputed the classic free will. He studied social determinism of behavior. Auguste Comte brought modern scientific methods from physical to social sciences. Emile Durkheim, who's someone I would recommend remembering, was one of the founders of sociology, and he developed a theory, if you guys remember this term, anonymy, which we'll discuss in a little bit. And the idea is that crime is normal in all societies. No matter how well you write your social contract, no matter what you do, no matter what laws you have in place, you're always going to have pockets, outliers of crime everywhere to some degree, whether it's a misdemeanor or felony, if you were to take Texas, for example. You had Charles Goring, who used empirical research to refute Lombroso's theory of the criminal types. And then you had the Sheldon and Eleanor Gluex, and they espoused primarily in the social causes of delinquency or juvenile crime, but also they postulated that psychological and biological explanations were there that could basically explain or attempt to explain why juveniles commit crimes. Now, you guys remember me talking about the famous Twinkie defense. Further in this section, when we got into this during the semester, we talked about possible theories as to why people commit crimes. All right? We looked at the biocriminology, the biological makeup, the chemicals. We looked at genetics. We looked at chromosomes. We examined the twin studies. When you had 2 kids, identical twins and fraternal twins, one went on to be a criminal, one didn't. We had adoption studies where kids that were, say from the Jukes family, that were adopted by a law-abiding family, did that child commit or not commit a crime? We looked at the IQ debate again. We looked at food allergies. We looked at sugar, glucose, and of course the famous right here on the screen behind me, right here, is the Twinkie defense. We had an individual who said, well, I just had too much sugar, too much Twinkies, and I couldn't control my actions, thus I committed a crime. We also looked at hormones, and how they affect juveniles in terms of violent crimes and committing physical assaults, sexual assaults, and stuff like that. Now, it wouldn't do justice in this chapter if we didn't stop for a minute and talk of the biological and psychological perspectives of Sigmund Freud. If you guys remember from our reading, he postulated the psychoanalytical theory, and he said that the human behavior is basically made up of 3 different types of components. You have the id, the ego, and superego. I would remember those too. Go back and review that. Now, the biological and psychological perspectives, we looked at attachment theories. We looked at observational learning and behavior modeling. When we look at the attachment theories, we're looking at bonding. How well did the individual bond to the parents, or did they bond to society? You know, if there was crime in the home, it was argued that it was a learned behavior like domestic violence or family violence, that if a child saw his dad hurting the mother, that child would think that was normal life. It basically created what we call a paradigm argument about learning behavior and then behavior modeling, what the small child or what the individual sees, and if they find that behavior accepting or they find it to be their new normal or their normal, they're going to model and engage in that behavior and embrace it as their own. Now, we talked about briefly Burgess and Ackers and their differential association reinforcement theory. Now, this theory suggests, and it was taken from Sutherland's sociological-based differential theory and Bandura's psychologically based learning theory, that there were two key points: that the persistence of criminal behavior depends on whether or not it is rewarded or punished, and the most meaningful rewards and punishments are those given by groups that are important in an individual's life, such as your peer group, your family, your teachers, your coaches, your instructors, the friends you hang out with and run around with. We also looked at the personality and mental disorders of crime briefly. We looked at personality types. All right, we looked at the ones who are truly psychotic, the sociopaths. We looked at the antisocial personalities. We looked at people who might have some type of mental illness. But in personality, we focused on Einstein's, I can never pronounce that and I apologize, conditioning theory, where he basically went deeper and looked at the psychocyticism as well as the neuroticism on the individual, trying to explain why some of them might engage in behavior that's because of psychological dispositions, meaning everything was about them. They had no empathy. They couldn't generate sympathy. They were just basically kicking in survival mode. We looked at psychosis, where people would disassociate from reality. They would hear things and see things that may or may not have been there. We discussed the differences between the psychopath and the sociopaths in crime. Next, we moved on to strain theory. Now, strain and cultural deviance theories, they're different, but strain theory argues that all members of society subscribe to one set of cultural values, i.e. the middle class. Cultural deviance theory, on the other hand, now they suggest or argue that the lower class people or the lower class individuals have a different set of values from the middle class, and those values tend to conflict with the middle class, so that's why we have a lot of clashing between the classes, or what we call class wars. This, going back to what I said earlier about Merton's theory of anomy, is where we have cultural aspirations or goals that people believe are worth striving for: money, success, education, prestige, houses, whatever. And they just simply can't reach it. So there's going to be a shift where they have institutionalized means or accepted ways to attain desired ends don't work, meaning they don't follow the rules aren't fair to them. Therefore, they use any means necessary to basically reach what they perceive as excellence or what they perceive as cultural aspirations to obtain those goals. Now, we also had some other theories in here that's worth mentioning. Social disorganization theory, which focuses on the breakdown of social institutions as a precondition for the establishment of criminal norms. We had differential association theory, which concentrates on the processes by which a criminal behavior is taught and learned. Basically, you have a protege and you're a thief. You teach younger kids how to steal. You start by pickpocketing. You start breaking into cars that are unattended. Then they graduate to residential burglary and commercial burglary. You have what we call cultural conflict theory, which focuses on the specifics on how the conduct norms of some groups may clash with those of a dominant culture. We're starting to look at gangs now. Right now in the culture, in Texas, for example, we're looking at MS-13. We're looking at people who act like Bloods and Crips and people who actively engage in human trafficking and organized crime type of that. That would be a cultural conflict theory, meaning that a lot of these kids never had a chance or never had the opportunities, they'll argue, because they came from a lower socioeconomic class or a lower class in the culture, to basically rise and have the same advantages of the middle class or higher class. Therefore, they got involved in gangs. They got involved in deviant behavior. Therefore, they started acting in crime or criminal ways or engaging in crimes in communities. So moving into the formation of subcultures, we defined what a subculture was. And a subculture, going back to the previous slide, is a group of individuals from the norm or the normal culture that basically act in deviant ways. Now, Albert Cohen did a lot of work on this, and his study on delinquency described, if you guys remember from our readings, we looked at 3 different types of delinquency. We looked at the corner boys, the college boys, and the delinquent boys. And when we focused on the delinquent boys for a moment, he came up with a term called reaction formation. Basically, this was them dealing in a negative way, or sometimes a violent way, or an inappropriate way, when it basically infused with the middle class, meaning they couldn't understand the rules, they couldn't understand the standards, they couldn't do the work in school, so they became the behavior problems. They became the abnormal or the outliers that were going to engage in some kind of disruptive behavior or something that was going to be basically against the norms of society. Now, Cloward and Olin's differential opportunity theory followed in behind this, and they basically said that delinquent subcultures flourish in lower class areas and take particular forms because they do because opportunities for illegitimate success are more equitably distributed than those for conventional success, such as gangs and organized crime, meaning that they don't have the opportunity, the jobs aren't there, the education's not there. They drop out of school simply because they have to take care of their family. So they have to basically join a subculture to survive. Then we looked at and discussed the subculture of violence. We looked at gangs. We discussed MS-13. We discussed the Bloods and the Crips. We looked at female gangs. We looked at now pockets of what we call terroristic sympathizers, both domestic and internationally, inside the United States, and how these people are kind of getting sucked up into that lifestyle and getting, basically disillusioned by engaging in that kind of activity. Next, we talked about social control theory. And this focused on the techniques and strategies that regulate human behavior and lead to conformity or obedience to society's rules, the influence of family and school, their religious beliefs, moral values, friends, and even beliefs about the government. Basically, we have a social contract. The theory to keep everyone in check, to live harmoniously, to basically coexist with each other is defined under some kind of social control theory. When people step away from this, all right, when people start committing crimes or violating the norms, we start to come up with theories as to why this happens and, more importantly, what we can do to try to prevent it. So here's a question. Who is the spokesman for the micro-sociological, what we call informal systems perspective, since the publication of his Causes of Delinquency in 1969? Now, I'm giving you a hint here, not just because I'm hungry, but because his last name, although it sounds the same, is spelled a little bit differently. But we're talking about Travis Hershey. And he posited 4 types of social bonds that are critical in social theory. We have attachments, we have commitments, involvement, and we have to have a shared belief. We attach to one another, our family, our friends, our schools. We commit to the ideals and values in our community. We abide by the law, whether it's a city ordinance, a misdemeanor, felony, we abide by it. We're involved in our community. We're doing something. We're not only taking the resources from our community, but we're also giving back. And then we have a shared belief. It may not be a belief in everything, but we believe that my neighbor and the people down the street and the strangers I don't know, that we can coexist, and that no matter if the government's looking or not, or the police are looking, or someone's watching us, we're inherently going to do the right thing at all the right times, not just for the well-being of myself, but for the well-being of everyone in the community. We also had an interesting theory that I personally find interesting, was David Matz's drift theory. And his theory was that you may have a juvenile that engages in criminal activity, but they typically don't stay there forever. And what we're talking about is that aging out process. Like in the mid-20s, 30s, David Matza theorized that maybe some of these guys, whether it's a guy or girl, they age out, they grow up, they don't want this criminal lifestyle anymore. They settle down, they get married, they have kids, and they stop engaging in crime. They start looking for legitimate businesses to join and start making an honest dollar and taking care of their family, and they don't want their kids growing up in the same environment they grew up with and making the same mistakes he or she might have made. Then we have Walter Reckless's containment theory, and he argued that there's basically internal and external controls in juvenile delinquency or in juveniles, meaning that internally we have a moral compass, we have the golden rule, our family values, we know what's right and wrong. Mom and dad hopefully instilled this on us, or our guardian or parent. And then we have the external controls, meaning the people you run with, your peer group, your teachers, your role models, that kind of help shape that individual into doing what's right and wrong. Next, we move into the last section, which was labeling, conflict, and radical theories. Now, labeling theory is something that we still see a lot of in society, and it's basically labeling an individual after they've committed a crime, or a juvenile, or a group of juveniles or criminals, perceived criminals, for having done something in the past and not removing that label. Now, I'm simplifying this, but let me read it. Labeling theory does not presume to explain all crime, but rather demonstrates that the criminal justice system is selective in determining who is labeled a criminal. For example, if you shoplift and you're 12 or 13 years old, it's what we call a status offense in the state of Texas, all right? You pay the fine, you do some community service, and typically out of sight, out of mind. If you say you become a sex offender, where you engage in some kind of sexual activity, whether it's intercourse, indecency, child pornography, or something like that, well, obviously that's a lot more serious. And because of the severity of that act, and depending on the number of victims and the circumstances, we put a label on that individual as a sex offender. And in Texas, they have to register for their entire life as a sex offender. And there's a whole bunch of hoops that they have to jump through if they get out of prison, if they're going to return to a community. Now, labeling theory also attempts to explain how labeling occurs, and it blames the criminal justice system for contributing to the labeling process and crime problem. Conflict theory identifies the forces that selectively decide in the first place what conduct should be singled out for condemnation versus which ones it shouldn't. Usually to the determinant of the powerless and the benefit to the powerful, meaning that those in charge pretty much decide if you're going to be a sex offender, we're going to have a label on it. All right. If you're going to be a teacher that has an improper relationship with the student, we're going to label you. If you get convicted and you end up getting 4 or 5 DWIs, driving while intoxicated, you have a label. All right. But typically, it's a lot of this happens at the upper echelons of society, who control the media, social media, and so forth. Jury pools, judges, and individuals like that kind of help strengthen the whole conflict theory. Now, the powerless are those individuals who are typically indigent, typically made a huge mistake, or got involved in something they shouldn't have, or made a conscious decision to do something dumb, and they got arrested for it, and they were tried and convicted, and so forth. But they don't have the means, motivation. Well, they may have the motivation, but not the means to change that label on them. All right, despite how much they do. And there are people who will go to great lengths to have certain things expunged off their record. They'll hire attorneys and they'll file briefs and motions to have stuff taken off, saying, well, he was a juvenile, he was 20-something years old, and all this other stuff. And it does cost thousands and thousands of dollars. Radical theory, this singles out the relationship between the owners of the means of production and the workers under the capitalism as the root cause of crime and all of the social inequities. This demands, by this theory, the overthrow of the existing order, which is believed to be perpetrated criminally by keeping the oppressed classes under the domination of the ruling capitalistic class. Going back to Germany, going back to Europe, even in some pockets of the United States during, when we were getting this country up and running, we had those that were in power and those that weren't. And those that weren't worked. And oftentimes they were oppressed, they were working long hours, safety issues. They had no voice in their government. They had no voice in their company or in their organization. And radical theory basically said, until you rise up and overtake them, it's going to be status quo. Other theories of crime we looked at was place and victimization. And we looked at a term called environmental criminality, which examines the location of specific crime and the context in which it occurred in order to understand and explain patterns. Basically, this is criminology, basically looking at crime analysis. Crime analysis is looking at where your crime's occurring, what times of day, and what types of crimes are occurring. And we try to make sense of it. Now, we have what we call rational choice perspective. And this was developed by Clark and Cornish. And they assume that there's a limited sense of rationality when people commit crimes, that they kind of understand what they're doing when they're weighing out. It may not be the best choice, but they're not entirely stupid as a lot of the earlier theorists believed. Most crime is neither extraordinary nor the product of a deranged mind. It's someone who just made a bad decision. It's someone who didn't weigh out the cost and benefit analysis of getting arrested or being thrown in jail or possibly prison. Then we have what we call routine activity approach. And this was developed by Cohen and Felsen, and they postulated that a crime can only occur when a target is unguarded and with the time an offender is not handled, the potential for a crime is there. It's a lot of words, but basically saying it's opportunity. If you go to work today and you leave your house unguarded, you don't have an alarm and the door's not locked, you don't have a dog, you don't have a sign, no one's in the home, and you just bought a 100-inch television and you leave the box of your 100-inch television on the side of the road for the recycle or garbage man to pick up, you've broadcasted that you've got possibly a 100-inch television in your living room or in your bedroom. Someone's going to walk up because you're at work, kick in the door. If you didn't lock it, open the door and walk out with your TV. And you've been burglarized. Not robbed, but burglarized. Burglary is a property crime. And sometimes we'll catch them, sometimes we won't in law enforcement. All right? But what we're basically saying is the victim being in this, basically not having enough situational awareness, creating the opportunity for someone to come along and basically make them a victim of a crime, whether it's a person's crime, property crime, or something else. There's basically, I don't know how you want to put this. There's basically an order or a formula in which this happens. Now, the types of crimes we concluded this course on is we looked at violent crimes. We looked at homicide rates. We looked at, asked why homicides occur. We looked at terrorism. We looked at assaults. We looked at domestic violence. We looked at rape or battery and sexual assault. Then we shifted in robbery. We also shifted our attention onto crimes against property. We looked at burglary, residential, commercial. We looked at theft. We looked at different types of theft, motor vehicle burglary, motor vehicle theft. We looked at all different types and tried to speculate why this occurs, and is it because the opportunity's there, or is it because you have someone that's weighing the cost-benefit analysis of getting caught versus obtaining someone else's valuable merchandise and selling it? We looked at white-collar crimes, such as embezzlement, computer crimes, counterfeiting, art theft. Then we looked at public order crimes, such as drugs, drunkenness, public indecency. And then we focused and concluded the class on international and comparative crimes or criminal controls around the country. All right, we looked at international crimes. We looked at terrorism. We looked at human trafficking. We discussed the black market. We looked at arms trading and stuff like that. So like I said, this was a lot condensed into a small time for your review. As always, if you have questions or need anything, my name is Dr. David Scott. Please come by and see me in my office at the College of Arts and Sciences, room 236. I'll be more than happy to sit down with you. I'll be more than happy to go in this information with you more in detail. If I don't see you, good luck on the exam and congratulations on your upcoming graduation. We're all proud of you here in the Department of Criminal Justice. Bye.